Good morning. I'm reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 to 12 in the NIV version. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all manner of evil because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Good morning. I'm reading from 2 Timothy verses 4 through to 7. This is Paul's letter to Timothy, encouraging him to be a missionary. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to mirrors. But you keep your head in all situations. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. For I am already poured out like a drink offering. But at the time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. Thanks be to God for this, His Holy Scriptures.
Thank you, Chris and Ralph. So today we come to the end of this historical journey that we have been on, exploring together the life of the founder of the Methodist Church, the Methodist movement, John Wesley. We started by looking at his childhood, his upbringing. We journeyed through his childhood into his early adulthood, the crisis of faith that led to his conversion, his discovery that he wasn't saved by all of his efforts, but he was saved by God's love. And then we went on to the fires of revival that spread across England and America. Today we explore the final chapter of John Wesley's life, the last third of his life, kind of from the time of his 60s up until his death at the age of 87, which was a pretty good age for somebody who was living in the 18th century. And this morning I want to invite you, just in these next minutes, just to explore with me four outstanding features of Wesley's latter years. Four features that can inspire us and can challenge us in our own life of following Jesus. I want to invite you to begin with me exploring John Wesley's perseverance, his perseverance. You know, one of the things that Jesus promised his followers, a promise which we might wish that he had never promised us, is that he promised us that we would face opposition. Listen to John chapter 16, verse 33, where Jesus said, "In this world you will face opposition." He didn't say you might face opposition. He said, in this world, you will face opposition. And then he gives that assurance, but take courage, for I have conquered the world. And so Jesus reminds us that the decision to follow him is not a soft option. That when you and I take following Jesus seriously, we will encounter opposition. Here again, the words that were read to us by Chris. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness." And Jesus goes on to say, in case we didn't get it, "Blessed are you when people insult you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." Now, I don't know about you, but when I face opposition, when people say bad things about me, I don't feel blessed, I feel cursed. But Jesus says, no, you are blessed if they are saying these bad things about you because of me. Jesus says that when such things happen, you are in the company of the great prophets, men like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Micah. You see, here's the truth. When God places a vision on your heart, and when you pursue that vision, you will come across people who oppose that vision. When you challenge the status quo, you will ruffle feathers. And when you begin to see success, there will be others who will be threatened by you. When you try to change things, you will discover that for many people, change is a 4-letter word. Ask Jacques Poe about the opposition that he is facing. Ask Thuli Madonsela about the perseverance that she required. Ask John Wesley, and all of them will talk to you about the importance of perseverance. I want to share with you one incident, one snapshot in the life of one follower of Jesus Christ as he sought to be faithful to the message of the kingdom. The follower that I'm talking about is Martin Luther King Jr. And he writes in one of his sermons about something that happened late one night in January 1956. His telephone rang, and Martin Luther King answered it to receive once again a threatening phone call. It wasn't the first that he had received. He had received many such calls. But on that particular night, he was feeling physically exhausted. He was feeling emotionally exhausted. And he writes how he became so discouraged that he considered just bowing out of the civil rights movement, just giving up. He was sitting at his kitchen table, and as he sat at the kitchen table in the dark of night, he cried out to God, and he told God that he was afraid that somebody was going to take his life. He told God that he was afraid for his family. He told God how he was at the end of his own strength. And he describes how as he prayed, sitting at that kitchen table, he experienced God's presence as he had never done before. And he almost heard God's voice whispering in his ears, telling him to keep standing up for truth and righteousness. He heard God telling him to persevere. And so he had the courage to continue to work for justice in his home country. Now, John Wesley, he faced very significant challenges of his own. Both his message and his methods were considered unacceptable to a church that had grown complacent and smug. And so Wesley challenged people. He challenged laity, but he also challenged the ministers, the priests of that time, to a deeper and more radical commitment to Jesus. He would preach that many of the people who thought that they were Christians seemed to be so in name only. He had a sermon that he titled The Almost Christian. And he preached that sermon called The Almost Christian to people who were half-hearted Christians, people who didn't have the joy and the assurance and the peace that comes from living a life totally surrendered to God. And these were people who lived their lives in compromise with sin, willing to do just enough good, but no more. They did nothing to seek to grow in their love for God. And so Wesley, as he preached, would call people to a high standard, reminding people that God expects more of them than just trying not to be as bad as the worst people out there. And because of these hard-hitting messages, this left those who were living complacent lives feeling very uncomfortable. And many church doors were closed to him. He was not allowed to preach from their pulpits. And so Wesley began preaching in fields, under trees. He began preaching in the market squares. He would start by singing hymns, and then a crowd would gather as him and his followers sang these hymns. And then he'd begin to preach about the need for salvation, the forgiveness of sins, about inviting people to wake up to God's presence amongst them. And there were people who were offended, deeply offended by his sermons. In his diary, Wesley recounts hundreds of such clashes. Here's one entry from his journal. on the 28th of August, 1748. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "At 1 o'clock, I went to the cross in Bolton. And there was a vast number of people, but many of them utterly wild. As soon as I began speaking, they began thrusting to and fro, endeavoring to throw me down from the steps on which I stood. They did so once or twice, but I went up again and continued my discourse. Then they began to throw stones. At the same time, some got up upon the cross behind me to push me down." And frequently in his journal, Wesley would record how he was pelted with rotten tomatoes and with manure and with stones. But he refused to give up. Why was he determined to keep on keeping on? Well, you see, in every congregation that he preached to, there were those who were moved by what he preached, who were changed by the message that he proclaimed. His journal, as well as describing the opposition that he faced, well, it also described the work of the Holy Spirit in the hearts and the lives of the people who heard Wesley preach. People who were brought from darkness into light. People who went from despair to hope. And because Wesley had his eye on the vision that God had given to him of a people and a nation transformed by the power of God, Wesley was able to persevere through adversity and opposition. So I wonder if maybe there's anybody here and you're feeling discouraged, maybe as you seek to proclaim God's light into situations of darkness, you feel like giving up. And maybe the example of John Wesley's life, the example of other saints in the faith who have persevered in the midst of adversity, is an encouragement to you to keep on. Oftentimes, being a Christian is about a long obedience in the same direction. And most worthwhile achievements in this world have been achieved by people who have showed perseverance and gees in the face of sometimes vicious opposition. Paul faced significant opposition to his own preaching, and because he persevered himself, he was able to write those words that Ralph read to us to Timothy. Towards the end of his life, Paul was able to say, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." So there's Wesley's perseverance shown in the latter half of his life that encourages you and I to persevere. That brings me to the second feature of Wesley's life, and that is his faithfulness in speaking out for those who could not speak up for themselves. His faithfulness in speaking out for those who could not speak up for themselves. So what happens is that after the initial period of the Wesleyan revival, in which Wesley faces much opposition, the Wesleyan revival, by the time Wesley is old, it's become a whole lot more respectable. There are tens of thousands of followers who have become a part of the Methodist movement. Wesley himself has become something of a celebrity, even an elder statesman in England. And as he enters this phase of being a man of great respect and a man who people listen to instead of throwing rotten tomatoes at, it would have been tempting for Wesley to say, "You know what, I paid my dues when I was younger. Now it's time for me to enjoy this season of peace, to enjoy the fruit of my earlier opposition." But far from saying, "Now it's my turn to eat at the trough," that's not what Wesley says. Instead, Wesley realizes that exactly because he has this stature, because he has this influence, that he must use that influence to speak up for people, the little people, who cannot speak up for themselves. Wesley was challenged by a verse from Proverbs 31, verse 8 to 9, which says this. It says, "Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." And so, beginning in his late 60s, Wesley begins to speak out against the voiceless in his society. And there was no group that were more voiceless than the slaves. And the English city of Bristol, as well as being a hub of Methodism, it was also one of the hubs of the trade in human beings. British slave traders would set sail from Bristol, trade for slaves in Africa, and then take them over to America, where they would be sold for tobacco and cotton and sugar, which would be brought back to the British Isles. And I'm pretty sure that there were Methodists in Bristol who were involved in the slave trade themselves. Maybe they even tithed out of their income from the slave trade towards their local Methodist society. Nevertheless, in 1774, Wesley widely publishes and then widely distributes a booklet that he writes called Thoughts Upon Slavery, in which he expresses strong opposition to slavery and the slave trade. A decade or so later, in 1788, he preaches a sermon against slavery in the Methodist chapel in Bristol. And this is what he writes in his diary about the results of that sermon. I've never had these results from any of my sermons. He writes this. He says, "The people rushed upon each other with the utmost violence. The benches were broke in pieces." So a fight breaks out in the congregation between those who supported slavery and the slave trade and those who opposed it. Wesley was not afraid of offending others in proclaiming the kingdom of God, if that was necessary in order to speak up for those who had no voice. The last letter that he wrote before his death was addressed to William Wilberforce, who was campaigning in British Parliament for the abolition of slavery. And in it, he encouraged Wilberforce to continue to fight against slavery. So here's a challenge to those of you who yourselves are in your 60s or your 70s or your 80s. Are you speaking up for those who cannot speak? Are you standing against injustice? Are you standing for the rights of the poor, the needy, those who are considered outcasts in our society, those who have been made to feel small because of who they are? Recently I heard of a church whose youth program has a wonderful project. The youth pastor of that congregation is training up the youth in that church to intervene in situations of bullying in the local high school, and working with the local school to support programs to stop bullying on the playground, cyberbullying, all expressions of bullying. What a wonderful kingdom idea. Christ followers are called to advocate for those without a voice. The third focus of the final year of Wesley's life was his concern about the temptations that come with wealth. So as Wesley looks back on 30 years of the Methodist revival, he notices a trend amongst his followers. He noticed that many of those early Methodist followers came from the lower ranks of society. And they came from backgrounds where as soon as they got their wages, they would go and drink them away, and they were not living wisely. And then they found Jesus, and they were saved. They cleaned their lives up. Methodists became known for their honesty, for their integrity, for their trustworthiness. They were good employees, and they were promoted. The Methodist class meetings also functioned as Stokvels, providing capital for Methodist entrepreneurs who were able to start their own businesses. Any of you have Wedgwood china in your home? If you do, the man who began making Wedgwood china, I think his name was Jeremiah or Josiah Wedgwood, he was a Methodist, and he got funding for that business from the people in his home group, in his class group, and he began making that and became very, very wealthy. And so what happened is that over time, the Methodists who originally were drawn from the lower classes, they became pretty middle class. And whilst this growing prosperity was something to be celebrated, in his latter years, Wesley expressed a growing concern that this prosperity was leading some of those early Methodists to fall away from their faith. And so in the last half of his life, one of the texts that he often preached on was from 1 Timothy 6, verse 9, which says this. It says, "Those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many useless and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction." And so Wesley's classic sermon to his followers on the use of money, he offered 3 simple rules for money. Those of you who are staunch Methodists might know and recognize these rules. The first rule was earn all you can. In other words, work hard. Earn whatever you can so that as long as you're not hurting yourself or others in the acquisition of your income. The second rule is save all you can. And he wasn't talking here about hoarding. He was talking about living simply, about living without extravagance. And on indulging our desires. Wesley had this to say. He said, daily experience shows the more they are indulged, they increase the more. And then the third rule for the use of money was give all you can. And here Wesley went even beyond the tithe. For Wesley, 10% was the baseline for his own giving. And in his latter years, his sources of income grew and grew and grew. He wrote many books which became bestsellers, and the royalties from those books meant that he had pretty significant income. Towards the end of his life, by the time of his death, Wesley was living off 10% and giving away 90% of his income. Give all you can. And so by preaching on how Christians used money, and in practicing what he preached, in walking his talk, Wesley reminded us that one of the measures of our spiritual health is our household budget. Perhaps if Wesley were here today, he might ask us the question, what does your bank statement say about your spiritual life? How we spend our money is one marker of how we are living out the commandment to love God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And so Wesley had grasped this truth that Jesus spoke about, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, what we do with our money is not just an expression or a reflection of our hearts, but it will also shape and direct our hearts. Sometimes we give first, and then our hearts follow afterwards. There was a lovely article that was doing the rounds on Facebook, or at least on my feed this week. I don't know if you saw it. It's an article about Pope Francis, who has received a new gift. Can anybody tell me what the gift was? A Lamborghini, that's right. The company that makes Lamborghinis presented Pope Francis with some hot new wheels, a white and yellow Lamborghini Huracan, and a kind of dream car. And then it went on to say that the Pope is going to auction the car, and he's going to give the proceeds from that auction to various charities that are close to his heart. Somebody had posted that article, and it was one of my colleagues, a fellow minister. He said, "Hey, what would you do if somebody in your congregation gave you this gift?" And various of my colleagues were posting in the comments section, what a difficult thing that would be to auction it and to give away the proceeds of that income. But Wesley, we know what he would have done. And I have a hunch that would have been what Jesus would have done. We earn all we can, we save all we can, we give all we can as an expression of our faith. Friends, the fourth feature of Wesley's final years was his example of dying well. And towards the end of his life, he spoke and he wrote much about what he called holy living. Holy living. Sorry, not holy living, holy dying. Holy dying. So what happened is that Wesley continued to preach outdoors until he was well into his 80s. He was 87 the last time he preached underneath a tree. And he talked a lot about what a good death looked like. Now, we live in a culture that doesn't want to talk about death. It wants to pretend that we are going to live forever. And that was prevalent in Wesley's time as well. But he encouraged people to think about their death, to acknowledge that their time here on earth was limited, and to encourage people to think about, are you ready to die? But not just are you ready to die, but what kind of a legacy is your life going to leave behind you? There was a woman called Elizabeth Ritchie who was with John Wesley when he died. She was his housekeeper, and she recorded how, surrounded by his friends and lying in his bed, Wesley gathered his strength and he said the words which you will often see engraved on the edges on the walls of Methodist chapels. He said this, he said, "The best of all is that God is with us. The best of all is that God is with us." He tried to sing the Isaac Watts hymn, "I'll praise my Maker while I've breath," but all he could say was, "I'll praise, I'll praise," as much as he could muster up. And right up until the end, Wesley sought to live a life wholly surrendered to Christ. And so I got to thinking about the difference between the 87-year-old John Wesley and a 93-year-old one-time president of a country to our north. One remained committed to loving God and neighbor with all of his heart and soul and mind and strength. The other grew to love power and wealth in a way which poisoned his soul and caused untold suffering to his people. And here's the thing, friends, that the way that we die and the things that will be thought, if not said, about us after we have died, will be determined by the extent to which we have lived up to Jesus' call, to love God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I want to close. I want to close with a prayer that John Wesley invited Methodists to pray regularly at the beginning of every year. It was a prayer of deep commitment. It's a prayer which we will pray in a couple of months' time at our annual covenant service. And it's a prayer which I will pray in the first person because I want to invite you to make this prayer your own. And as I lead you in this prayer, to pray it from your hearts. It is the words of Wesley's covenant prayer. Let us pray. God, I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine, and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant now made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen.